Germany built one of the wealthiest societies on Earth, driven by a world-class industrial engine that funds a famously generous welfare state. At the core of this system is the generational contract, a pay-as-you-go financial setup where today's working taxpayers directly fund the retirements of today's pensioners. This promise held up perfectly because it relied on a specific demographic dynamic, a massive, booming mid-century workforce. This graphic illustrates the math of the 1960s. We see a perfect balance, with 5 working Germans generating enough taxes to easily support every single retiree. That exact 5-to-1 ratio is the engine that built modern Germany's stability, wealth, and public comfort. But the math quietly broke over half a century ago. Germany's fertility rate dropped below the replacement level, flatlining at an average of 1.4 children per woman today. When we map a 1.4 birth rate onto this chart, projecting it forward over 4 generations, the result is a 76% drop in total population. Combine that shrinking base with people living much longer, and the structure entirely flips. We get a massive surplus of retirees relying on a severe deficit of young workers. Germany's median age has now pushed past 45, and with 13 million baby boomers retiring by 2036, the system cannot absorb the weight. The demographic setup that drove half a century of prosperity has inverted into a mathematical time bomb, pointed right at the state treasury. That stable 5-to-1 ratio from the 60s is gone. Today, there are only 2.5 workers to carry each pensioner, and as we look at the scale for the near future, the burden gets heavier. By the 2030s, the ratio drops to just 2 workers bearing the cost for 1 retiree. The pension funds actually ran out of enough internal revenue decades ago. To keep the payouts flowing, the government began quietly plugging the holes with general tax dollars. This pie chart shows the severity of the patch. The federal government now spends roughly a quarter of its annual budget just to prop up the pension system. That is more money than it spends on education, research, infrastructure, and defense combined. This massive tax drainage effectively transfers wealth from the working youth to the retired old, prioritizing immediate pension payouts over long-term economic stability. To pay for that transfer, young Germans face immense deductions. Taxes and mandatory contributions take about 40% of an average worker's salary and push toward 50% in higher brackets. Once you subtract that tax burden and factor in a national housing shortage, an entire generation is locked out of building their own wealth. The housing supply has flatlined due to strict local opposition, expensive new building regulations, and high demand in cities. Buying real estate is so expensive that even young couples with dual incomes and solid professional careers struggle to afford basic properties. By taxing its youth to the breaking point to maintain senior benefits, the state ensures that young people cannot afford to start the very families needed to stabilize the collapsing birth rate. Fixing this requires legislative action, but democracies run on votes, and right now the older generations form a massive, unbeatable voting bloc, creating a feedback loop where politicians only pass policies that protect the elderly. The result is a legislative trap, a society perfectly optimized to secure the comfort of its senior citizens at the direct expense of the youth. Many look to mass immigration as the obvious fix, hoping foreign workers will take over the tax burden. Importing temporary labor only delays the math because new arrivals eventually retire and need support themselves. Furthermore, birth rates are crashing almost everywhere. The global pool of young, mobile workers is shrinking, meaning the supply of willing immigrants will soon dry up. An aging voting populace actively uses the levers of democracy to reject the bitter financial medicine needed to save the country. The 2030s will bring the full force of this crisis: millions of unfilled jobs, heavily congested healthcare systems, and climbing poverty rates for the very pensioners the system was supposed to protect. Germany is simply the first to hit the wall. The exact same demographic cliff is fast approaching other European nations like France and Italy, and across the Atlantic, the United States and Canada are tracking right behind them, facing the exact mathematical collapse of their own generational systems. The collapse of the generational contract has evolved into the defining Western crisis of the century, mirroring a pattern seen far beyond German borders. Solving this equation requires intensely unpopular political decisions that will disrupt the deeply held expectations and financial comfort of older voters. It means taking a harsh look at the budget, reallocating vast wealth currently reserved for retirees, and heavily investing it in affordable housing, free childcare, and aggressive incentives for young families. Modern societies must either embrace this painful restructuring of priorities now or face the mathematically certain collapse